The People's Platform.
Good evening and welcome to the People's Platform. There's a saying that those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it. Let's discuss the future of history tonight. My guest tonight is historian Shamara Wettimuny, joining us for the first time on the show. Good evening and welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here, Sonali.
Absolutely wonderful to have you here in our studio, Shamara. Firstly, let's talk about the importance of history education. We know that history builds empathy, history helps us interpret the past, understand cultural diversity, helps us understand identity and belonging. Apart from these reasons, why should we make a case for the importance of history education?
Yeah, Sonali, I think you said what I think are some of the most important reasons for learning history is that particularly at a school level, shall we say, history can become a tool that's used for even building communities, because it's where children for the first time get a sense of where they've come from, how they belong in a society, what their forefathers did before them. But at the same time, history, if not done properly, can also be incredibly divisive. So, for instance, there are, including in Sri Lanka, but also in examples abroad, you have history syllabi then that leave out more than they include, and at that can be actually incredibly damaging, particularly for the children who are wondering where are their histories, why aren't they represented? Are they outsiders in some way? Are they aliens and latecomers? So history then is deeply politicized, and it needs to be done very carefully.
When we look at history, it's not a singular history. There are multiple histories, and there are a multiplicity of narratives. So how important is it for us societally and for you as historians to ensure that a multiplicity of histories is represented in history education?
Absolutely. So you're right that there is this common misconception that history is definitive, that there is one truth or one narrative, when actually history and the process of doing history is actually about layering our knowledge. It's about taking new information, new research, analyzing evidence, and adding to our understanding of issues and events. It might be easy if I try and illustrate this with an example.
Sure.
So let me take one of the better known histories, international histories from the 20th century, the Second World War. Now, we are taught from a fairly early stage that the Western allies, that is the British, the French and the Americans and the Soviet Union, were the good guys, the allied powers, and then the Axis, the Nazis, the Japanese and the Italians were the bad guys. But as more research has been done, what we've seen is historians have actually complicated that narrative and they've added nuance. They're not apologizing for the heinous crimes of the Nazis, but what they're saying is, for example, in 1945, once the Nazis were defeated and you had Allied occupation of Germany, a mass systematic rape of German women took place. Now, how many of us are aware of the victimization of these women, of the terrible atrocities they endured? And what history is doing, what layering and adding narratives to history is, it's showing us just how important nuance is. There's not just one history, as you said, and we only stand to benefit from exploring new and alternative narratives.
If I can bring your attention to Sri Lanka's current situation from a transitional justice lens. We learned from our past? We have had 2 bloody insurrections, civil conflict. We live with so many traumas which we haven't properly resolved, and we know very little of the mistakes of our own past. Yeah. So if we don't know our own mistakes from our past, how do we ensure that we don't repeat them in the future? We talk about guarantees of non-recurrence, but from an individual point of view, we need to know what we did wrong so that we don't repeat it again.
Yeah, I totally agree. And there is this unfortunate approach to dealing with a traumatic past, which is like, it's better to move on. Let's not dig up, these things. It's better to leave these things in the past and move on, and let's think about the future. But it's not up to us. It's also particularly, it's not up to the victors to decide. Very often, it's important that victims are given a choice to decide. Victims may choose to leave those difficult histories behind and to forget. And very often in Sri Lanka, as with, I think in what I'm finding in some of my research on the 1915 anti-Moor pogrom, is that a lot of the victims from the 1910s and 1920s have chosen to forget. And if that's their agency, so that is okay. But victims of more recent pogroms, 1983, massacres taking place in the context of the armed conflict, those victims don't want to forget. They want to remember. They want to memorialize. And I think that is their prerogative. There is no way for victims in particular to move on unless they've had their voices heard. And I believe it should be it's up to them to decide whether they want to forget or whether they want to remember.
And in this context, let's also talk about how history can be distorted, how history can be erased, and our responsibility to make sure that it does not happen.
Yeah. I think, for example, how many children understand why the 1971 Marxist insurrections took place? The fact that we had two Marxist insurrections and huge disappearances, I think while the school history syllabus has failed us in that it does not teach our students post-independence history in any meaningful way, aside from referring to legislation and some the process of constitutional reform, I do believe that the alternative space, the non-state history education initiatives are making important progress in terms of giving voice, bringing back the marginalized, shining a spotlight on communities that didn't make it into our textbooks, like the Malayaha Tamil community, for example, who don't really feature, are having to be given space in exhibitions. And these are meaningful and important steps, I think, in the right direction of educating our youth.
Shamara, we in our school syllabi, we learn about ancient kings and kingdoms. But like you said, post-independence history is not taught in a meaningful way. So how do we even sort of intelligently and with knowledge and awareness figure out our own political and economic biases without knowing the mistakes of the political and economic mistakes of our fathers, of our grandfathers?
Yeah. This is why there is a need to actually, while yes, as you mentioned, our prehistoric and our ancient history is important, and that gives a sense of perhaps pride. It's not always about being proud. As you said early on, we need to also know where we went wrong, and there's nothing wrong with acknowledging that we've made mistakes. But it can also help us make sense of the present and also plan for the future. So if I give you an example, now let's take the issue of federalism. Now today, federalism, particularly in certain ultranationalist circles, is a dirty word. It's tantamount to separatism. But I wonder how many people are aware of who some of the earliest proponents of federalism is. Now, in 1926, for example, it was S.W.R.D. Bandaranayake, future Prime Minister, who first suggested a federal system for Sri Lanka, for Ceylon at the time. The next year, in 1927, it was the Canadian National Association, a regional body, that also said we believe a federal system is the way forward, and proposed a division of the country into 3 units: a Canadian unit, a Low Country Sinhalese unit, and a Tamil unit. But we've forgotten that. We aren't aware of that. And it is only in 1949 that the Federal Party, the Tamil political party, the Federal Party was born. But this idea of federalism had currency, widespread currency to some degree, as early as the 20s. Isn't that useful to think about? Doesn't that help shape the way we think about the future of this country?
We're in conversation with historian Shamara Wettimuny. We're going for a short commercial break. We'll be right back.
The People's Platform.
කඩලපූරි උනුනේම කන්න එන්න. එයාට කඩල හොඳ නෑ නේද?
මට කන්න ඕනේ නෑ.
මොකද්ද මේ කරලා තියෙන වැඩේ?
ඇයි මොකද?
මම හොඳටම දන්නවා මේ ගෙදරට ආපු එකම අරමුණ. විශේෂ ත්‍රිපාඨිය බලාගන්න එක විතරක් නෙවෙයි කියලා.
ඔයාට කිචි කවද?
දෙනවා මම වැලමිටින් පිටට එකක් හරිද?
So cute. ඔයා කියව තමයි ඔයාට හරියන්නේ ඉම්ලි. වැඩකාරකම.
අද රාත්‍රී 9:30 සිරස ටෙලිතිරයෙන්
දැන් මම කොල්ලෝ සෙට් එකකට ගහපුවම කොහොමද බං උන් නළුවෙක් වෙන්නේ?
වැක්සිනේ!
අනේ වඩින්න බෑ බං.
මගේ හුද්දම යාළුවෙක්ට ගහලා සර්. මන්ත්‍රීතුමාට ගිහලා කියන්න මං ඡන්ද ඉල්ලන්නේ නැහැ.
අනු බබා මං වා උස්සනවා.
ඒ කියන්නේ ඔය උමර
සර්කස් කාරයෝ අද රාත්‍රී 8ට සිරස ටෙලිතිරයෙන්.
So these are the three industries that, very interestingly, the industries that brings in dollars to this country, right? The tea, the garment and the migrant workers.
There was a time when the plantation child was seen as a child who was groomed to be a domestic worker. But then things have really changed.
when one domestic worker migrates, I think an employer pays to almost 800,000 to 1 million rupees for one domestic worker.
Not only participation, becoming politician, but also exercising your voting rights as a citizen of the country.
Creating public awareness is one of the important things that should happen. And then the workers need to be organized, and then facilities given for them to sort of organize themselves and demand for their rights.
Face the Nation, Wednesday nights at 9:30 on TV1. TV1. TV for life.
Sri Lankan fishermen freed from armed group. Sri Lankan youth trapped in Myanmar cyber hell cry for rescue. CID arrests social activist Piyak Nikeshala. Former army chief Dayaratnayaka joins the SJB. New state ministerial portfolio for Lohan Ratwatte. 18 government sector trade unions launch sick leave campaign.
TV1. TV for life. The People's Platform.
Welcome back. We're discussing the future of history with historian Shamara Wettimuny. Shamara, we find that politicians and persons with vested interests oftentimes create divisive and flawed narratives of history. And what happens because of this is that masses who aren't really aware of the nuances of what is being portrayed get swayed. So my question to you is, who writes history? We know that it's historians who are experts in examining and interpreting human identities, transformation of societies and civilizations over time. They use analytical tools to reconstruct the diversity of the human experience. But is that what actually happens?
So to also first speak to your first comment, that's a really good reason. The politicians being able to manipulate the masses is a really good reason for people to do history, because we're taught as historians to actually question critically grand sweeping statements about the past. But in terms of who does it, so it's the job of a historian to deal critically, to use their judgment, to absorb lots of information from various different sources, but really think about those sources, where they come from, and see, to basically try and get to the bottom of it, and to try and see what happened from a variety of perspectives. What I've heard from some work I've done with university lecturers, history university lecturers and history teachers, is that unfortunately, particularly history teachers aren't given the respect they deserve in terms of the fact that they are actually trained and that history is a discipline. Instead, what we find very often is in the school system, there's an assumption that anyone can teach history. And so teachers come and say that, for example, there's this assumption in schools that, for example, if a mathematics teacher has a free period, they can be brought in to teach history. These people aren't equipped to actually deal with some of the very sensitive and important issues. And what they end up doing is they fill in gaps. If a child questions them, they'll fill in gaps from pop culture, movies they've seen, or talk shows that they've listened to. Hopefully not this talk show. But there is this idea that history is not seen as a professional discipline in the way engineering or medicine is. Now, just because I've watched a couple of episodes of House, Grey's Anatomy, and read the latest publication from Oxford on a vaccine for malaria, does not mean I can be trusted to teach about it. But there is this assumption that history is something that anyone can do after reading a couple of things, and that's dangerous, because it's in that way that you have all these misconceptions about history, that history is politicized and also manipulated. And as you said, the word you use, history can be distorted in that way.
Shamara, let's also talk a bit about colonialism and the importance of decolonizing our mind.
Yeah. So this is a huge debate actually in Europe, the idea of decolonizing curricula, decolonizing public spaces like museums, for example. And I'm afraid I don't think we've made enough progress. We say, you know, we're this proud post-independent state, but actually you take the National Museum, for example, and I think that's a space that still needs to be decolonized. For one, there's nothing, again, about the post-independence period. The most recent exhibits, in terms of the chronology of what the museum showcases, stops during the British period. There are paintings from around the 1850s. Those are the most recent exhibits to my knowledge. Forgive me if I'm wrong on that. But the point is, that space should have been developed and added to. We should be having things from the 20th century. Even the early 21st century is now is part of our history. But it's still a space that was, in a sense, as it was when it was built by the British. So really, how far have we decolonized?
So what do we do to sort of go about rectifying this?
Well, there is important work that is being done, and I do recognize and acknowledge it. In terms of, for example, the looted artifacts from the Netherlands that were returned in December, I think 6 objects were returned to begin with, and it's seen as a process that will continue with more objects being returned over time. That, even though those are, you know, our objects from our colonial past, our Dutch colonial past, in this context, it will hopefully create space for new conversations around the repatriation debate and decolonization, reparations, as well as, you know, looking at new connections perhaps between Sri Lanka and the Netherlands. So I think there is a move slowly in the right direction, but we have a long way to go.
Shamara, my final question to you is again on the importance of meaningful history education. We know that the past teaches us about the present and provides a crucial perspective for understanding and solving current and future problems. We spoke about how history builds empathy through studying the lives and struggles of others. So if you could just take us through some of the key aspects which are central to history education for school syllabi.
So in terms of reforming school syllabi, I would focus on 3 areas in particular. First, I think we've touched on quite a bit, which is the deficiencies in the content, the gaps, the omissions. We've talked about it in terms of missing minority narratives or missing post-independence history. So I won't go on further about that. Second, I think pedagogy is a problem. And what I mean by that is the way we teach history. Now, teachers themselves can't be blamed because sometimes they're not given appropriate training. And even further out of their control is the fact that they have to have students pass examinations. And when our school system is geared towards 100% examination, you don't have time to get, the teachers don't have the time or space to encourage critical thinking, to encourage intellectual curiosity. They too need to have the students pass and get the highest mark possible. And so in that sense, what happens is they're taught to memorize and regurgitate without thinking critically. And the final most important aspect of how we would reform education is also open up access to the channels or to the sources of information that we can use to develop these alternative narratives, to grow our knowledge. Now, the National Archives has been a complicated place for several decades, but it is going through a very important process of reform and change. There's a wonderful Director General at the moment there, Dr. Nadira Rupasinghe, who's doing a lot to improve accessibility, transparency, and in general, improve the ability for young researchers, for teachers, for university lecturers to go and make use of the wealth of information that's held in there. That said, the archive is incomplete in that it was a colonial space to begin with, so it preserved what the colonizer felt was important, and thereafter what the state felt was important. And again, in a sense similar to our textbooks, it tends to leave out just as much as it includes. And so alternative spaces and new collections that are being digitized by non-state organizations are also going to be very important in the future in terms of reforming education.
Okay. Shamara, I've always felt that this sense of ego and self-obsession that we have oftentimes, and also lack of knowledge and information about our histories, often makes us feel like we're right. And I feel like if we were to be given an opportunity to read about our past, watch documentaries of our past, speak to people from other communities about their past, and also share stories of our past, we'd collectively be weeping and grieving and promising each other and ourselves that we wouldn't repeat our mistakes. What are your thoughts on that?
I would agree, and I think slowly but surely there is really important work being done in the vein that you have suggested. Sadly, it's not taking place, as far as I can tell, through the state. It's taking place through organizations, individuals, initiatives. But it is so important, and I think, for me, it's not a sign of weakness to say we made mistakes, we did something wrong. Instead, by admitting our failures, we are less likely to repeat them. Meanwhile, we can embrace our plurality, our diverse populations, our languages, our cultures. There's so much beauty that for some reason we are intent on sidelining. So I think it's a generational change. We're looking at this can't happen overnight. This can't happen with, one political change. This is something that we have to think about as taking place over the course of a generation, but it has to start now.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, historian Shamara Wettimuny. This has been lovely. I look forward to having you on the show once again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Sonali.
Thank you. Thanks for watching us. We'll see you again tomorrow. Mr. Chandra Jayaratna will be joining us. Good night.